Hello. Today I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the shoes of a young woman, a 21-year-old woman named Debbie. She was living in Philadelphia in the year 1730, and she had to make a big decision. In fact, it's a decision that is the biggest decision many people ever have to make in their entire lives. I'm going to give you a bit of a background, and I'm going to ask you to imagine what you would do, what you would have done under Debbie's circumstances. Debbie Reed, that was her maiden name, was 15 years old when she first encountered a young man on his very first day in Philadelphia. She was standing in the doorway of her father's home on Market Street in Philadelphia. It was a Sunday morning, and a young man who seemed to be, well, he was a strapping young fellow, and apparently reasonably good looking, healthy, but looked very tired. He looked like he had been on the road and probably wearing the same set of clothes for a week or more. The clothes gave indication that he had been afoot for a while, that he had been caught out in the rain, perhaps that he had even been sleeping out of doors. He wasn't a very prepossessing figure, but he walked with a certain air of confidence. Debbie watched him from the doorway of her father's house. He seemed to be a couple years older than she was. In fact, he was 17. His name was Benjamin Franklin, and he had just arrived in Philadelphia from New York, and before New York, from Boston. He left Boston under rather inauspicious circumstances. He had run away from home, and he had run away from an apprenticeship that he had. He was bound by law to his elder brother in a print shop in Boston. His elder brother James had taught him the printing business, but hadn't allowed him to exercise his newly developed talents, to the point where Ben Franklin became very resentful of James. James was 9 years older than Ben, and James lorded it over Ben the way an older brother might, and the way the master in a master-apprenticeship relationship might, and he did. And Ben, as I say, grew resentful, and he decided that he couldn't stand it anymore. He had to get out of town. So he engineered his escape from Boston by boat. He had to do it under false pretenses, but he got away. He hoped to go to New York and find a job there. There were no jobs for journeyman printers. A journeyman printer was the halfway house between an apprentice, journeyman, master. Ben was still an apprentice legally, but he knew enough to pass himself off as a journeyman, and he would have lied his way into a job. And so, but there weren't any jobs there, so he kept going. He kept going to Philadelphia because he'd heard in New York that perhaps there were jobs for printers in Philadelphia. He knew very little about Philadelphia, except it was the biggest city in the American colonies at the time, and so why not give it a try? He had gone by boat from Boston to New York, but from New York to Philadelphia, he went mostly overland. He couldn't afford the fare on a coastal ship, and so he managed to talk his way on board a river ferry across the Hudson River, and then he walked across New Jersey and reached the Delaware River around Trenton. And he was walking along the towpath along the Delaware River when he spotted some people rowing a boat down the river in the general direction of Philadelphia. He managed to persuade them that he could assist with the rowing, and so they let him hop in, and he did indeed help them row. And he arrived at the waterfront, the foot of Market Street in Philadelphia on a Sunday morning in 1723. And he had all of 3 pennies in his pocket. And it was with these 3 pennies that he was going to have to make his way. He was starving. He hadn't eaten in 24 hours or so. And so he went to a bakery, which happened to be open that morning. He bought 3 puffy loaves of bread. I don't know what they were, some kind of muffin or puffy thing anyway. And he was munching on one. He had two in his pocket and he was munching on one. And in his other pocket, his dirty socks and linen were hanging out of his pocket. He was walking along Market Street munching on the bread, wondering what was going to become of him, how he would make his way, when he walked past Debbie Reed. Now, Debbie Reed at 15 was of an age where a woman in colonial times might begin to think about getting married, getting a boyfriend and getting married. She seemed to like the appearances of Ben Franklin, and over the next several months they were introduced, they became acquainted. In fact, Ben Franklin, for a time, rented a room in the house that Debbie was living in with her mother and father. And so they got to know each other a little bit better. And Ben Franklin hadn't been intending to get engaged or married, but one thing led to another, and they began talking of marriage. But nothing was settled. Nothing was for sure. And Ben was at least as interested in advancing his career as he was in settling down and getting married. So anyway, he is working on his printing career. He's gotten a job working for a printer, and he is sufficiently good at what he does, and he's sufficiently enthusiastic and promising that his boss decides to send him to London to get some new equipment. In Philadelphia, in colonial America, almost nothing in the way of printing equipment was manufactured. You had to go to England, you had to go to London to get it. And so off Franklin goes to London, and he has a letter of credit from his boss saying that sell my assistant Benjamin Franklin this stuff, and I'll pay you when the time comes. Franklin is really excited to get to London. London is the biggest city in the British Empire at the time, and it is the metropolis. It is, well, in a later day, it's like New York would be to young Americans of a later day. The idea that if you can make it in the Big Apple, referring to New York, you can make it anywhere. With Franklin, if you can make it in London, you can make it anywhere. So he finds himself in London, and it is the most exciting place he has ever seen. There are lots of people. He had grown up in Boston. Boston was a small city. He had visited New York. New York was even smaller than Boston at this time. Philadelphia was bigger still, but it wasn't really big. Philadelphia was the equivalent of modern small town. But London was the New York or Tokyo of its day. It was huge. And there were things to see, things to do, people to meet. Between one thing and another, Ben Franklin sort of forgot about Debbie. As I say, they had this informal agreement that they were going to be married, but it was only informal, and Ben perhaps took it less seriously than Debbie did. So he wrote her. He wrote her once or twice, and she wrote back, but gradually the letters at his end got less frequent and less frequent, until finally she assumed that he had simply forgotten about her. His trip to London was supposed to last maybe, it would take a month or 6 weeks to get there. He would spend 2 or 3 months looking around, sizing up the market for equipment and all the stuff he needed, getting that, and then another month or 6 weeks coming home. So maybe 6 months at the outside. But 6 months became a year, became 18 months, became 2 years, and Ben was still gone. So Debbie assumed that he had fallen in love with London, fallen out of love with her, and was never going to come back. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking for her. She's now pushing 20 years of age, and for a young woman in colonial America to reach 20, 21, and not be married, you started to look like you were unmarried because nobody would have you. Marriage in those days was as much a matter of economics as it was of romance or love. And the big question for the parents of a young woman like Debbie was, can we find someone who will make her a good husband? By which they meant, will this person, this man, be able to support her? Will he be able to take her sort of off of our responsibility? We have had the responsibility for feeding, clothing, raising her, and the whole thing until now, but she's an adult, and so she needs to be no longer our responsibility. But it was a little bit more than that, because in those days there was no such thing as Social Security. There were no old age pensions, and a child, especially a daughter, was expected to be the economic support of her parents in their old age. So it was really important to marry your daughter off to someone who had a promising future, promising in the sense of a future in which a profession, an occupation in which this guy could make some money. So this was basically what Debbie was thinking, what her parents were thinking for her. And they had thought that Ben Franklin was a pretty good catch. He seemed, as I say, he seems to have been a reasonably attractive guy, but he also was ambitious. It was clear he was talented, he was smart, he was going places. But it turned out the only place that he went so far was London. And this was a common thing. Talented young men in the colonies often gravitated toward the imperial capital. They went to London and they never came back. So for all Debbie knew, Ben Franklin was a lost cause. He wasn't writing her, he wasn't replying to her letters. So she decides, okay, well, I've got to look out for myself. Another new guy moves to town. His name is John Rogers. And John Rogers was a potter, someone who made pots. He was into ceramics. So it was a craft, it was a very necessary craft. Someone who was good at this could develop a thriving business. People needed the stuff, the plates, the goblets, the pots, the other stuff that a ceramicist can make. And John Rogers talked a pretty good game, and he talked himself into winning the hand of Debbie Reed in marriage. Now, Debbie's parents, John Reed and Sarah Reed, were a little bit nervous about John Rogers because they didn't know his background. They didn't know his parents. They didn't even know exactly how old he was. They didn't know how much money he had. If Debbie had still been, say, 17 or 18, they probably would have said, Debbie, this is not a good match for you. You can do better. But by now, Debbie is about 20, and it's not at all clear that Debbie's going to be able to do better. And even a husband who's not or at the top of the A list was better than no husband at all. So with the approval of her parents, and there's every reason to think that she was okay with it, Debbie marries John Rogers. And the two are married, and they set up housekeeping in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, as I say, was the equivalent of a modern small town. And everybody knew everybody else. And so people knew Rogers, and they knew Debbie. They knew more about Debbie because they'd seen her since she was a little girl. They knew Rogers, and they watched the marriage develop. And they developed some concern with years because Rogers had this habit of leaving home and being gone without explanation for a while. He also had a bad habit of getting himself into debt. He bought things he couldn't well afford. Perhaps he even gambled. But the result was that he was generally in debt to people. And what this meant was that Debbie was in debt to people as well, because although husbands in marriages controlled the property, the debts that were incurred were debts that the wife or the widow would have to pay if the husband couldn't or wouldn't. So people were getting concerned for Debbie and about Debbie, people who knew her, people who liked her, people who loved her. And then John Rogers goes on one of his trips to where nobody quite knew, and he didn't come back. And Debbie was left married to this guy who had disappeared. Nobody knew where he had gone. It was said that he had spent some time in the West Indies. The British colonies, the British Empire included colonies in the West Indies, so he could have come from there. It was said that that's where he was from, and maybe that's where he had gone. There were some other stories, some other rumors that developed around John Rogers, and one that was perhaps the most disturbing of all, as you could understand, is that he had been married before he married Debbie. Now, in order to understand what this means, this was in a day when divorce was essentially unheard of. Marriage was for life. And the only way you got out of a marriage was for your spouse to die. And so Debbie was in this position where she didn't know if John Rogers was still alive. She didn't know if he had died. People died in shipwrecks. People died of disease. It happened. People died suddenly all the time. But beyond that, she didn't know if she was even legally married to John Rogers in the first place. If he had been a bigamist, if he was still married to a previous wife, then Debbie's marriage to Rogers would not have been valid. So she's in this situation where she doesn't know what situation she's in. She is either unmarried, never married, somebody who has been made a fool of by this guy who wanders in from out of town and talks himself into her good graces and then talks her into a marriage to him. So she's either been fooled by this, or she is the abandoned wife, which is maybe, I don't know, worse, where well, in either case, she's been abandoned. And maybe she's been widowed. So there are kind of three options here. One is that she was never legally married in the first place, so she is, and always has been, legally a single woman. The second possibility is that she is married, but Rogers is gone, has abandoned her, and isn't coming back. Actually, maybe he's going to come back. And the third possibility is that he has died, in which case she's a widow. But because she doesn't know which situation she's in, she doesn't know what to do. In the middle of her dilemma, while she's trying to figure out what to do about all of this, Ben Franklin comes home. He comes back from London. He's had enough of the high life in London, and he decides that his future is in Philadelphia. Now, there's little reason to think that he came home because he was longing for Debbie. In fact, he had heard through mutual friends that she was married. So he assumed that that possibility had been foreclosed. But he comes back because this is his new home. He thinks there are business opportunities here, and he's going to take them up. So he comes back to Philadelphia. And he does start or restart his printing business, and that seems to be going fairly well. And he re-encounters Debbie and discovers the fix that she's in. Well, whether she has a husband legally or not, there is no husband around, and they rekindle their romance until they start thinking about, well, maybe we should get married after all. It's a little bit unclear. Well, it's pretty unclear actually from this distance as to whose idea this was in the first place, or maybe we're talking about the second place here. Was Debbie the one who broached the idea to Ben? Was Ben the one who raised the idea? Probably it was a little bit of both. And Ben was in the mood to get married. He realized it'd be a good idea to settle down. He had had various romantic affairs in London, and they didn't work out, and he decided that it would probably be better to settle down, and it would also certainly be good for his professional prospects. People, especially in those days, had greater confidence dealing with someone who was happily, or at least securely or safely married. A single young man, well, it was a time when people were simply expected to be married. And if you weren't married after a certain age, and by this time Ben was pushing 24, if you weren't married at a certain age, then people began to think there was something rather odd about you, maybe something wrong with you. And so they weren't sure they would want to do business, for example, with someone who couldn't form the kind of relationship that's the base of any marriage relationship. Besides, Debbie had learned enough. She didn't spend any time in formal schools, but she had learned enough around her father's business. He was a contractor, a builder, a carpenter, so she had helped out there. She'd learned enough about business, about managing business affairs, that Ben had an idea that she would be a pretty good partner in the business. She could handle the books, she could deal with customers when he was doing the actual printing and typesetting and all of that. So it seemed like a pretty good idea. There was some concern that Ben Franklin wasn't bringing enough to the marriage because, well, he didn't have any money, and Debbie's parents, under other circumstances, would have expected that he demonstrate that he could support her. Now, sometimes, well, I should say, the economic scrutiny worked both ways. So an eligible bachelor looking for a wife might very well hope that she could bring something to the marriage partnership because the husband-to-be was assuming economic responsibility for her. So marriages in those days were economic mergers as much as they were joinings at the heart. Well, it turned out that neither side, neither Debbie nor Ben at this stage, was in a position to bring much in the way of money to the table. And each one had sort of almost reached the sell-by date for being an eligible prospect in a marriage. And so they eventually decided, we're meant for each other. Now, they had the continuing problem of what happened to John Rogers. Is Rogers around? If they do get married, wait a minute, can they get married at all? Debbie, according to the laws of Philadelphia, at least as far as anybody can tell, is married to John Rogers. And so they can't get a church to marry them because this would be prima facie bigamy and a violation of the commandments of God and the church and all of this. So, and then there's the legal aspect of it as well. Bigamy and adultery, these were crimes, and people could be punished. They could be whipped for violating the marriage laws in this regard. So what are they going to do? There's reasonable prospect that John Rogers is, one, dead, two, never coming back. But on the other hand, not that long ago, Ben had been in the similar situation vis-a-vis Debbie. She didn't know he was ever coming back. And there were times when she didn't know if he was dead or not. So anyway, amid this uncertainty, they decide they're going to go ahead and make the best of the situation, the best they can of the situation. They're not going to get a church wedding. What they are going to do is establish a common law marriage. Now, a common law marriage was a situation in which a man and a woman would simply announce to their neighbors, we are now husband and wife. They would move in together. They would take up what to all outward appearances was married life. They would have children, and assuming that nothing arose to repudiate this marriage, for example, that no wayward husband who was thought to be dead should reappear, then over time this marriage would come to be seen as a perfectly valid marriage, as valid as any performed by a judge or in a church. So they prepare to get together, to take up residence together, to make a home together, to announce themselves to the world as husband and wife. And all seems to be going just well. Debbie's dilemma up until now has been resolved. But then Ben drops a bombshell on Debbie. And the bombshell is this. Ben discovers only weeks, perhaps a month or two, before the date on which they're going to move in together. Basically, just shortly before the wedding, that he is going to be a father. He's going to be the father of a child by a woman other than Debbie. In other words, during their engagement, during the time when Debbie and Ben have been trying to figure out how they're going to get together, how they're going to deal with the missing John Rogers and all of this, he's been fooling around with somebody else. And he got the woman, pregnant, and she's going to have the child. So Ben learns this. One can imagine Ben's state of mind when he learns this. This apparently was not Ben Franklin's first affair, but as far as he knew at this point, this was the first time one of his affairs had ever led to the prospective birth of a child. So he has to figure out, what am I going to do about this? And how am I going to break the news to Debbie? Ben decides fairly quickly, apparently, that he is going to take responsibility and custody of the child upon the child's birth. This is actually pretty unusual for an infant, a newborn, but basically from the moment of conception, from the moment of birth, to be taken in by the father rather than the mother. But this is the decision, and quite apparently, the mother didn't dispute it, which leads us to believe that the mother was probably not in a good state financially. She probably couldn't afford to raise the child. Possibly having a child would have put her in an embarrassing situation. It wasn't unheard of for unmarried women to get pregnant. It was not, I won't say it was a full-blown scandal. These sort of things happened, and especially in those days before reliable contraception. These things happened, but still, it was not no woman in this situation would boast about it. Her parents didn't boast about it. So it's possible that the woman was someone who, could sort of go into hiding for the last 3 months before the world knew she was pregnant, have the baby, and then hand it off to Ben, and maybe she could pretend she'd never had a kid. But it's a little bit unusual here because she's never in the picture after the birth. Now, obviously, she's in the picture at the birth, and a very essential part of the whole thing, but she is lost to history. Now, I'm going to digress very briefly to say that I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin some years ago, and when I took on the project, I determined I was going to find the identity of this woman, because she is the mother of Benjamin Franklin's oldest child. The child's going to be named William Franklin. He's going to grow up to be a very important figure in the life of the American colonies. But nobody, as of the time I started writing the book, knew who his mother was. And if you think about it for a minute, this is pretty unusual. If there's a question of parentage, it's almost always a question about who's your daddy. It's almost never who's your mama. But in this case, historians have, well, to make a long story short, I tried and tried, but I could not figure out who William Franklin's mother was. Who was the mother of Benjamin Franklin's oldest child, first child? Anyway, so Ben Franklin gets it in his head, I'm going to take custody of the child, I'm going to raise the child as my own. But meanwhile, he is engaged to be, in effect, married to Debbie Reed Rogers, maybe. And he has to break the news to her. So, as a historian, I have often wished that I could be a fly on the wall at certain moments in history where the documentary evidence, where the historian's evidence falls silent. And we just wonder sort of what happened. So I imagine they're walking maybe along Market Street. They're outdoors somewhere. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe Ben took Debbie aside, but maybe he wants to have her in some place where if she gets really upset, she's going to be kind of constrained by the presence of others. Because one can imagine that she would be very upset. So, if you were Debbie Franklin, if I were Debbie Franklin, I'd certainly be upset. So how does he put this piece of very important, very unnerving information to Debbie? What does he say? How does he do it? This is where I would like to be a fly on the wall. What did he say? And then, so what's Debbie's reaction? And so here's the question. Here's what all this is leading to. So suppose you are Debbie Reed Rogers, about to be Debbie Reed Rogers Franklin, and your fiancé tells you that, in essence, he has been cheating on you during your engagement, and the cheating has given rise and is about to give birth to this child that he is going to take custody of. So your soon-to-be husband is about to be a father, but not the father of your child, the father of the child of some other woman. Oh, and yes, and the kicker to this is Ben has to say, "Dear Debbie," in some form or another, and I would like you to help me raise the child. So Debbie is about to become Ben Franklin's wife, and apparently, well, he's asking her to be the stepmother of his child. A child that she had no idea was going to exist, was going to come into being. So what does Debbie do? What would you do? I want you to think about this for a moment. Would you slap him in the face? Would you scream and yell at him? Would you walk out of the room? Or if you're outside, would you turn on your heel and walk away and say you never wanted to see him again? What would you do? What would your reaction be? Now, I don't know. I don't know what she did. I don't know what she said. All I can tell you is how it turned out. In fact, the wedding, sort of such as it was, the taking up of housekeeping together, proceeded pretty much as planned. And the child was brought into the Franklin household and was raised as Ben's son and Debbie's, well, technically stepson, but over time she began to think of little William as her son. And in fact, as little William, Billy, grew up, he called her mother and she called him son. So we know how it turned out. We don't know exactly how Ben and Debbie got over this rough patch. Did Ben fall down on his knee and say, "My dear, I cannot live without you"? Did she think, well, boy, I've had bad luck in husbands and matrimony so far. Can it get any worse than this? Did she think, well, I really love him, we can get over this? Did she think, boy, I'm getting old and I'm not going to have a better chance than this, and at least he looks like he's going to be able to support me? I don't know the answers to these, but I'll leave those for your imagination. That's all for today.